What is the recent political context of the conflict in Ukraine?
That Putin's invasion of all Ukraine was a great surprise to me, and regarded it as a crime and an error, even though I do think that the Russian position in that conflict over the last 8 years does have some merit. And there were things done in the course of the US Ukrainian relationship that really were a kind of raw deal from the standpoint of Russia. I think the great instance of that is the United States support for the Maidan Revolution in 2014. Now, that term revolution is significant. It was a revolution, and it overturned the existing constitutional order in Ukraine. That constitution had been made in the 1990s, and it reflected, the balance of interest in a nation that was divided between Russian speakers in the East and Ukrainian speakers in the West, with a lot of overlap between them, but nevertheless, a cleft country, as Samuel Huntington called it in his Clash of Civilizations, where the historic memories and the political aspirations, really almost everything, divided people very deeply in the East from the West. The 2014 Maidan Revolution was extremely significant because it represented an overturning of that constitutional order. And I think that one can gain some kind of appreciation of the significance of that if we ask ourselves what would have happened on January 6th, 2021, when that band of brigands tried to overturn the electoral procedures in the United States. Now, that's been widely denounced as a crime, as it was, rightly so. But if you imagine what would have happened had Trump succeeded, or had his followers succeeded in changing the vote. Trump was declared president. He was now the supreme leader. And the question would be, under those circumstances, would California or New York or any other state of the union have an obligation to obey the new government? And my view is that no, they wouldn't, because the government had been seized. There had been a usurpation. The constitutional order had been overturned. And so Americans would then find themselves in a kind of state of nature. Well, I think that's what happened in the Ukrainian case. Ukraine had a provision in its constitution forbidding any province from seceding. But if you take the view, as I do, that the revolutionary seizure of power by the 500,000 people in a square in Kyiv overturned the constitutional order, then that provision of the Constitution, like every other provision of the Constitution, had been effectively annulled by them. So that's a iconoclastic view that you won't find in American media, but I do think that it's founded in very solid constitutional principles, which I've made it my study to understand as a professor. I've written many books on the founding of the United States, and I'm very familiar with all of the constitutional arguments attending separation from Great Britain, the formation of the Union, and they're all really quite relevant to what went down in Ukraine. All right, anyway, that disordered Ukrainian politics, it shifted it way to the West and away from the East. Crimea and the Donbass were severed from it. They were no longer represented. And that is really the origins of the current mess.
What is the end goal of Putin's invasion of Ukraine?
As I say, I don't think that Putin's invasion was an appropriate response to that. And there's a lot of things wrong with it. And I think there's a lot of things incoherent, kind of stupid about it. Let me give one example of the war aims that Putin has set forth. One of them, the Russians say, on the one hand, we do not want to occupy the country. But they say, on the other hand, we want a different government in this country. Now, those are inconsistent. It's like, it's very similar to what the United States did in 2003 when we invaded Iraq. And you'll remember at the beginning, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld said, we don't intend to occupy. We're going to be out at the end of the year, and the UN will come in and solve our problems for us. Well, of course, didn't work out that way. Once you go into a country, you have to stay there interminably if you want to achieve your objectives. And if you don't, if you get out, well, it reverts to the previous situation. So there's this big incoherence about what it is that Putin sees as the end game.
What was the role of the US and the West in the onset of the conflict, and what did it mean for Ukraine?
Well, I was one of the people that participated in the argument about NATO expansion, and that got underway in the 1990s. And there were all sorts of wise American statesmen like George Kennan who said, don't do it. Ultimately, this will provoke a reaction from the bear. And that's dangerous, not only for the entire world, but for the people that you were ostensibly trying to protect. Now, I think looking at the outcome here of this devastating war in Ukraine, that warning ought to have been heeded. And we didn't heed it. The United States proceeded very carelessly in that direction, towards a NATO expansion. And the most problematic candidates for expansion were always Ukraine and Georgia, because Ukraine had always been an integral part of the old Soviet Union. There's a long history behind that, but it obviously is something that the Russians care about. And they warned repeatedly that they saw this as contrary to their vital interests, meaning that it was something that could conceivably bring the military instrument into play. Now, if you think about what the United States did with regard to NATO expansion, there was something extremely strange about it, because, of course, it was never something for right now. It was something for the future. So we were insistent on the principle that NATO could expand, but we weren't going to do it right away. So that meant that the Article 5 guarantee of NATO would not be done right away. And I think the best way to think about that diplomacy of NATO expansion is to see it as a kind of magic trick that had this sort of now you see it, now you don't character to it. It was intended clearly to intimidate the Russians. It was also intended to reassure the Ukrainians. But it was a magic trick because at the end of the day, it wasn't real. That is, it did not betoken an intent on the part of the United States to go to war if Russia invaded Ukraine. And I think that the United States led the Ukrainians on in that regard. Now, when the change of administration, the election of Biden made a big difference in this regard, because there was a whole series of steps that were taken all throughout the past year that indicated a much tougher stance towards Russia. The Crimea platform that Zelensky introduced, the closure of Russian media stations, and the arrest of Medvedchuk, the important Russophone leader in Ukraine's east, on charges of treason, the closure of other independent media, the language law, very important, which required all people to, in a public setting, to address one another in Ukrainian unless specifically requested. That would be an interesting experiment to run in New York City, to require all the Spanish speakers to speak English, unless otherwise requested. Well, of course, they would find that to be intolerable. As in a free society, it is intolerable. You're not supposed to offend people, interfere with people's lives in such a way. But that was the Ukrainian law, and it generated a tremendous amount of ill feeling on the part of the Russophone population. Anyway, all of those steps the past year were undertaken with this idea that we've got your back. We're going to protect you. We're there for you. And then it turned out that we couldn't be. We couldn't be because that meant World War III. And that was way too dangerous, not only for the United States, but, the entire world, which would be inescapably bound up in the consequences. So, of course, there are very few retrospective judgments of what caused this war that blame the United States, and all the blame is placed on Putin. And I understand that a lot of the blame does have to fall on him because he launched this particular war. But at the same time, I think that we really did the Ukrainians wrong. That is, we led them down the primrose path, an expression that John Mearsheimer used, which is apropos. Now, Mearsheimer's analysis, I don't think, is entirely correct because he says that Ukraine was de facto made a member of NATO. Well, no, that's not true. I mean, what is true is that NATO training missions went there. Those NATO training missions built up the Ukrainian army. So they were doing a lot of things for Ukraine, but it was not a de facto member of NATO because it did not have the real Article 5 guarantee that the United States would go to war if the Russians invaded. It was always kind of a pie in the sky idea anyway. It was something we were going to do 15 years from now. And but the Ukrainians really wanted to believe that it meant in the here and now. And, that's why Zelensky and all of them really have their stomachs tied in a knot with the sense that the United States betrayed them. And, the United States feels bad about that because I think there's an understanding in the United States that, yeah, we did betray them. So we're going to make it up now. But that's the irony of the current situation, that we can't really make it up by going to war. We can't make it up with military supplies because at a certain point, if they're significant enough, that would also mean war. And we can't make it up with the sanctions because the sanctions are extremely devastating to Russia. No doubt about that. They're not going to get Russia out of Ukraine. That never happens in the history of economic sanctions. They're not effective in forcing a great power to say to itself, oh, we made a big mistake and we're going to retreat now. They don't do that, and they're not going to do it in this case. So the next question would be, well, would they be effective in overthrowing Putin? And I just don't think there's any evidence of that.
How can the US and West response to the invasion be described in military terms?
I think there's two remarkable features of that. And one is that concerns the military resistance that the Ukrainians are making to the Russians. And the question is, will US military aid fortify their resistance such that Ukraine can defeat Russia? Now, I don't think they can. That's not entirely clear because the scale of US assistance is not entirely clear. And the administration is walking a very fine line there between intervening in the war with something like a no-fly zone and also sending lots of military aid, like anti-air missiles. The report this morning is that we've sent 2,300 of those. So that could constitute an intervention, but my view is that insofar as the sending of military aid offers the possibility of decisively altering the outcome of the war, it constitutes an intervention and therefore, raises the risk very seriously of a US-Russian clash. I don't think that that's going to happen. I don't think that the Biden administration wants a military clash with Russia. And so my sense is that the war ends, or that Ukraine essentially has to fight the war with the army it has, as all states do when they find themselves suddenly and surprisingly at war. So in terms of the military situation, I think that means that Russia achieves its military objectives in the east. That is, it will encircle the Ukrainian army that was there before the war, menacing Donbass. What happens in Kiev is beyond me. Clearly, the Russians have encountered far more obstacles than they anticipated. The Ukrainians have fought tenaciously and done some very clever things to stop the Russian offensive. We're setting up for a big battle over the fate of Kiev, and that's tied into the war aims that Russia has. And I don't know how that will end. That's a very difficult thing to foresee. But there is a sense in which the aid that the United States is now rendering Ukraine in a military sense will not achieve the objective that we want. It might be justifiable for other reasons down the road, but it's not, I don't think, going to change the outcome of the war in the next 1 to 2 months.
What about the economic sanctions?
Now, the second point, or the second prong of the U.S. Response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine has been unprecedented economic sanctions. And the most important of those economic sanctions is the freezing of the Russian trust fund, or its foreign exchange reserves. That was numbered at $630 billion by President Biden in his State of the Union address. Most estimates put it at about half that. But whatever the figure, it's really the principle of the thing, because I think what the principle of the thing establishes is that effectively all contracts between Russian businesses and the West are nullified, abolished. Russians can't sell goods and receive cash in a bank that is itself subject to seizure by the Western authorities. And so I think the Russians have pretty much made that clear in their response. Putin said there's going to be no payments on Russian debt so long as that measure persists. And I believe that it will continue to persist and that Western policymakers won't walk back from it. Now, I regard that as a weapon of financial destruction, a WFD, to employ a variation on the old WMD expression. And I think it's huge. It essentially reduces all relations between Russia and the West to a kind of barter in which money can't change hands because money no longer represents anything real. And so, imagine a gun for drug swap between two sets of mafiosi in a remote warehouse with plenty of backup and, ready to call in the snipers if things go awry. Something like that is what we're looking at. Now, as a commodity producer, I think people from Mexico can appreciate what that could conceivably mean in terms of that big complex of grains, energy, and agriculture where the Russians are a big player. And it's a huge wrench into the gears. I think, there's a real possibility of defaults on various commodities exchanges because under these circumstances, the Russians will walk away from their obligations. So, who backstops the various people that are involved in these defaults? Well, that's not very clear. Anyway, I think that will ultimately be seen, that is the seizure of Russian bank reserves as a WFD, that it will entail very far-reaching consequences in this context in which you get the abolition of contracts. You do it in a sector or sectors that have seen profound underinvestment in the last decade, which, they put us in danger of gigantic price explosions in a lot of separate commodities. To try to replace, to raise up instead of this massive dependence on China. Okay, so just to summarize that major point, I think that the seizure of the central bank reserves is a huge thing, and it's going to have all sorts of cascading consequences for the world economy. And I think these consequences will be far more serious than policymakers are now acknowledging.
In this context, what will the role of China be in the conflict?
In terms of the efficacy of the sanctions, I think that there's something that is very important to bear in mind, and that is that it's all going to depend on China. Russia and China have made a deal, and they now consider themselves permanent allies. Of course, there's a long history of antagonism between Russia and China, and it was actually a lot bigger in the 1950s and the 1960s than it is today. And those sources of antagonism will continue to exist, but I think both sides have come to the conclusion that the United States is agreement incapable, as both leaders have said of the United States. And so they're in an enduring partnership. And in some ways, you could explain that by the fact that the American policy for the last decade was dedicated to the idea that they couldn't have any other friends. And so they only have each other. Now, I think that's real. I think that what that means is that Russia reorients its entire economy away from the West towards the China bloc. And that means its production of energy, metals, food will go there. And China will probably receive preferential pricing on those, which is very attractive to China because it makes its competitive positions in world markets all the more formidable. Now, the United States is going to try to prevent that. That is, it is going to try to prevent the rescue of Russia by China. And how that works out, I think, will be a great drama of the coming months. I don't think that the United States has very good cards to play. And that's an interesting question to think about, that dependency that exists. China exports 500 billion thereabouts of goods to the United States. We export 100 billion to them. So who has power in that arrangement? Is it the producer or the consumer? Well, as in all such standoffs, both sides can do a tremendous damage to the other, the one by refusing to buy and the other by refusing to sell. But I think that China's position in that kind of standoff is more formidable. That is, they can afford to not sell more than we can afford to not buy. And because China occupies so vital a role in so many of the world's supply chains, you know, the pressure on China means you've got to get your supply chains elsewhere. And, you know, that could be Vietnam and that could be a lot of different places, but Mexico is a natural partner in that regard. And so I do think that that is something for you to think about, how that unfolds and what that's going to mean for, you know, new deals with to try to replace, to raise up instead of this massive dependence on China.